So I'm going to assume that we know we're here for the Fourth Plinth talk series, and Antony was the, how do we describe your role in this? The curator of an event called One Another.
Instigator.
The
instigator, yeah.
Provocator, I would prefer. And there's lots of things that we can look at around that event, but also maybe reaching into some of Antony's other work. Hugh's written interestingly on that work, and on One Another especially. So I'm thinking, well, we'll start with a personal view, because many people here, and most of you I assume, went and saw part of it, or have looked at it, or know of it. And what struck me looking at it, even though I only saw the guy who was whistling, if you're here, that was great, you know, an hour of whistling was fine. But what struck me was not necessarily him and the event, it was people watching what was on the plinth. So I'm thinking, in that space, it seemed unusual. It stopped people and made them look at the city in a different way. This actually reaches into other aspects of Antony's work, if you think of event horizon and so on, the idea of the look and the gaze. The first thing it reminded me, however, was a weird moment in New York when I watched what was happening when the Twin Towers were hit by the plane. People normally going about their business in that city were craning their necks in a way that usually only tourists do, right, when we look at those big, tall buildings. So the first thing I wanted to get you to comment on, both of you, is what was it about that space that was changed by making people look in a place where, for so long, people haven't looked. It was an empty space, that Fourth Plinth, right, as everyone knows, until '99. And now it's been substantially fulfilled over time.
Yeah, how many of you actually were on the plinth? Not one. One. Oh, good. So we've got a few representatives. So maybe at some point we can listen to what you have to share about your experience. I have to tell you that when the first idea of using the mid-19th century plinth that was made for William IV, the son of George IV, as a site for contemporary art, I thought this was an extraordinary insult to all living artists, that the best that they could aspire to in central London was to use the handed down, unused bit of Victorian street furniture that happened to be in Trafalgar Square. And it took a long time for me to think of how one might use the very fact of the presuppositions of what art could be in the collective space of a major capital in a way that was meaningful, rather than it simply being 14 by 5 square feet of, in a way, frame for what you had to offer. And the fact is that Trafalgar Square is a place where a very determined heritage-based notion of national identity is reinforced. And you can say that Trafalgar Square lies at the end of a balance between the Houses of Parliament at one end of Whitehall and the National Gallery at the other. Political and cultural power expressed through this dialogue. And what do we find on Whitehall? We find our totemic ancestor figures, usually male, military, over life size, to do with death, to do with heroism, to do with great acts done in the name of. And I guess I just wanted to use all of the presuppositions of an empty plinth in terms of the identity or the expectations of the representative person that might aspire to be memorialized on a plinth. Confront that with something far more fugitive, far more vulnerable, far more contemporary.
I'd like to return, I think that's crucial what you're saying about the nature of the place and the political geography of the square. But if I think about what it was like to go to the plinth during one another, I always think about, when I think about it, I think about the sense of liberation, a curious feeling of being liberated by being there. And it'd be interesting if other people felt that. And I think, when I think about that sense of liberation, I think more and more it's to do with what you just said. It's this, when you're in Trafalgar Square, in that part of London, you're invited to share in what is the greatness of Britain. All that greatness of Britain is overwhelmingly suppressive of one's individual identity. It's about hierarchy, it's about power, it's about us all being the same people as members of this British society. But the people on the plinth, your participants, were witty, eccentric, surprising, ordinary, in some ways extraordinary, but not in ways that were to do with the greatness of Britain. And I think the sense of liberation was to do with being a witness to, and in a curious way, as you were saying, a participant in an event that denied and defied and to some extent overwhelmed what it means to be great in Britain. Because it was about ordinariness and wit and humour and all that in fact is best about this country, and a repudiation to some extent of all that I think is worst about our heritage anyway.
When you say great, you mean militarism.
Military great, well great.
That square is...
Yeah, military great in that we are very important. We are this mighty nation in the world. We have this huge empire, all these symbols of empire there. I mean, there's the South Africa building on one side of the square, Canada on the other side, there's these lions, the simple scale of it, all completely inappropriate to our time and to our actual experience of life now. And yet, this kind of greatness is an exercise in false consciousness in this country, especially since the Second World War, as an exercise in deception of the entire public, I would say. So it's that relationship to greatness that I think that one another somehow took us to in a very interesting and liberating way.
So there's a sense in which we can talk about one another maybe as democratization of art, although I want to put that word always in question marks and under erasure and so on, as something to be debated. But to what degree was it perhaps a containment of that? Because what I want to ask you is actually, you instigated this, you planned this, and of course you put a work out into the field and it's open to interpretation, and probably the more interesting things are what you didn't expect. But I want to ask you at what point you lost control, and I think it's a good thing sometimes to lost control of the project. When people did things that...
No,
or
but
was it the
John,
organisers?
I lost control of the project very early on. I mean, well before anybody got up there, because I realised that it was totally impossible for me, in a relatively small studio just behind the King's Cross station, to organise something like this. And right from the very beginning, what was quite... I mean, we were lucky to get Helen Marriage on board and get the Artichoke people to agree to do the administration. But that was only the first step, because then we had to have the call centre with 68 people taking calls of inquiries. We had to organise the thing so that every single hour the person who had, by a strange mixture of design and chance, arrived at the point of getting there, that they were there, that they felt that this was their moment, that it was like doing 2,400 single-hour theatre pieces, where the whole, but basically infrastructure had to work, and this was something that I couldn't do on my own. What was fantastic was that actually this was then replicated, obviously, at the point where I was simply saying, here is this place of representation, a empty frame in which the idea of value, the idea of national, the idea of identity are all up for grabs, and let's see what happens. And I had no preconception about. It was very, very important to me in terms of how the mechanics of the selection worked, that people didn't go into what they immediately, or the general public, as it were, immediately thought that this was a talent competition, and that they were going to be chosen on the basis of how brilliant their proposals were. So right from the beginning, we realised that we had to distribute the hours demographically. So London had something like 315 hours, whereas the Orkney Islands had 30 maybe, or even less than 30.
Decided how? Sorry.
Decided by simply by how many proportional to the population.
Not.
And then we divided it in half male, female. And then it was entirely random, the selection of people. And this was really, really important. So that this was not about, as it were, the theatre of self-representation. There was a degree of complete randomness in once we had distributed, as it were, male, female, and demographic distribution about who arrived there. And from that point onwards, it was a matter of seeing what happened. And from my point of view, this was a monument in terms of a reflexive object, but made in time by 2,400, as it were, bricks of time. And that it was the total, it was, as it were, and this is something we were talking about earlier, that still needs to be registered. What does this tell us? This litmus test made up of these individual moments. What does the whole thing tell us about us now, about our time, about our aspirations, about what we're frightened of, about what we look forward to, about what we want to remember, about how we regard ourselves?
Yeah. Maybe Hugh should comment on this, compare it to the mass observation.
Yeah, just to for a moment challenge this notion of randomness. In a sense it is random, but in a certain sense it's not random at all, in that people have to self-select.
Yeah.
So an area has a certain number of hours, but the people have to volunteer themselves. That's a very pretty tight window through which people are passing, isn't it?
Yes, you have to admit that this is a self-selected cohort of exhibitionists.
Well, exhibitionists, or is it somehow also introspective? I mean, there's a sense.
I mean I think that exhibitionist doesn't do the job. What was extraordinary is the degree to which people didn't know themselves. I mean, those that took the project, in fact, in the way that I had conceived it, that it was simply a transposition of life, as it were, from the shared collective pavement to the plinth, and then see what happens. See what happens to the way you feel, having been put in the position of idealization or representation. And a lot of people did take that invitation, and the response to it was very different. So some simply whistled, some actually were well, there's one girl who's in the book who was agoraphobic. She found it she had gone into the project with huge reservations about whether she could handle it, and she spent her hour on the top of the plinth in a hunched position with her head between her knees, and it was one of the most moving and extraordinary moments, because this was the public exposure, in a way, of personal vulnerability. So I think it's not fair of me to characterise this cohort as a self-selecting bunch of exhibitionists, because for whatever reason, I think people applied for a very, very wide range of reasons. We did end up with actually an extraordinary range of people, of which exhibitionists were a part.
Over 34,000 applications and 2,400 or something. That's 6% of people who applied got on. So the sense in which democracy is, well, yeah, democracy is a bit like that, isn't it? The percentages. But I'm really interested in whether or not this introspection or exhibitionism, how it works as a taking the pulse of the nation or a snapshot. Now, Hugh's written interestingly on the Mass Observation Project and how it's different to this project. But I'm also thinking that the context and the time of this so-called snapshot, if it is one, if it does take the pulse of contemporary Britain, it isn't quite important.
It does seem it is very, very important, I think, to think about the moment in time when this is happening. Perhaps there's two kinds of time here. There's a moment in time which is to do with this era where people feel very free to do things for themselves, where people, on the whole, feel they have voices, where certain kinds of television programs, the X Factor, for example, have created an idea of the possible expression of self being triumphant, and that's very much of our era. And I think that if you'd done this plinth in the 1950s or even the 1990s, I suspect it would have been surprisingly different. And then there's the other moment of time. This was conceived between the Iraq War and the 2010 election, wasn't it? Right? It's a particular moment in national history where there's a sense of deep disaffection with the political culture. Perhaps one of the eras, perhaps I don't know how long, or maybe the beginning of a long era, or perhaps a brief moment where a majority of the nation was probably at odds with national projects and purpose. Do you think that has any relevance to what was going on? Either of those things have any relevance to what was going on the plinth?
It's the eve of what the austerity fees demonstration to the students, yeah. Arab Spring, the August of 2011. Yeah. Okay, maybe the Olympics have erased that, but those things are very much a kind of part of that time.
I was very touched by how many people chose, in a way, to use the plinth as a place of memorial. And there were people who talked about relatives who died in the First World War and the Second World War, but also people who died of AIDS, of cycling accidents in the inner city, in the Iraq War, in Afghanistan. And this was paralleled then by personal stories of loss, of babies lost at birth, of spouses or loved ones lost through cancer. And that was an extraordinary, I think, reinforcement of one of the ways in which memory, in some senses, can be carried or objectified in the public art of our cities. But of course, this was of a very different order. This was about personal revelation of loss in a public space. And I think that Hugh is quite right that this wouldn't have been possible in the 50s. And it's an indication, I think, of a kind of a loosening of those boundaries between private experience and public utterance.
Yet sculpture is very, very often nostalgic or memorial, or it's memorial, but it can also be somehow nostalgic or reaching back in time. And this event, I'm interested in how that recodes that kind of gesture. I'm saying, I'm sort of suggesting that it's maybe also a bit nostalgic. Nostalgic for the possibility of taking the pulse of Britain as one place, because there are so many different things at the same time, but somehow there's like an anthropological survey kind of sensibility behind this idea that somehow we can take a selection of whether they're extroverts or introverts or just the lucky people who haven't been voted off the plinth yet. But to what degree is it a kind of test or a working out of whether or not you can move from that nostalgic element of sculpture into something else? And I think about this in relation to your other work. For example, what I call the sentinels, the figures at the top of buildings. They're mute, they stare out and they look at us, but somehow it's a conversation when you see them from far away. You look up and you crick your neck, but they make you think, what are they witnessing now as time passes?
It's a really intriguing question, this, the level of, how much the question is the form. In other words, what are the things that art can carry effectively, and or is it just wishful thinking? This idea that this is a kind of litmus test of the state of the nation now. I think that it's probably a vain hope that you could ever do that effectively or objectively or in any way comprehensively. But I think the attempt to ask questions about, I suppose, how we can make representations that are not about power, not about narrative in a traditional sense, but can be reflexive. In other words, and that's where I think Event Horizon, these, I think, nameless, meaningless, empty body forms that are placed, as it were, at the false horizon or at the skyline where the built world interfaces with infinite space, where those are just interrogations. They are saying, here is the idea of a human space in space at large, a black hole in human form that demands your projection and asks very simply, where does the human project fit in the scheme of things? And to the degree to which our cities as animals, our habitat has now become the means of our separation from the elemental world, what are we? And in that sense, one another could be seen as the most old-fashioned physical anthropology kind of specimen demonstration in the manner of the early demonstrations of people from Tahiti that came back with Cook and were presented to the Royal Society.
I want to resist you a bit here.
Good.
I want to resist you with this when it comes to the idea of nostalgia. I don't think the feeling from the plinth was nostalgia. I know there were people who memorialised victims in the First World War, people who talked about their own lives in some form, but I don't think the feel of it was nostalgic at all. And that cumulatively, if you went quite often, or if you flip through all the images in the book, or you look at the video on the exhibition here, you get a sense of something that's completely not nostalgic. It's something that's all about fun. A lot of it's quite silly. People making fools of themselves in rather sort of charming ways. It's not. I think to suggest there's nostalgia there is to pluck out a few individuals and then confuse the whole with those few individuals. It's also to create a bond between what you did with the Fourth Plinth and the rather oppressive nostalgic quality of those imperial statues by which we are often surround it. So
less a bond than a questioning or a confrontation or a undermining.
well, it would be an undermining, precisely because it is so anti-nostalgic, therefore it's an undermining of the nostalgic quality of all that imperial architecture and monumental art. So I'm very much inclined to resist
A test attempt at undermining that.
Yeah.
I think the problem with Trafalgar Square is it's such a designed and orchestrated space for containing demonstrations, for containing cultural performance. You know, every week there's another group presented there and presenting themselves there in some kind of smorgasbord of multiculti Britain. And in some ways this is like a black hole you mentioned, fake. You know, the story about the black hole is this atrocity in Calcutta that probably didn't happen, that justified the imperial.
Yeah, and there is Napier, who in some senses is absolutely associated with the British project in India. I think that there were extraordinary moments. It's a very impossible thing, I think, to try and make a characterization of the whole process of this. It was like an infection of this public space with an energy that was uncontrollable, that I had no wish to control. And there were extraordinary moments. The guy who had the idea that he was going to do an alternative Olympics in slow motion and not only do the commentary but also organise people from the plinth. It was absolutely fantastic. It was so anarchic and so totally brilliant. The slow motion 100 meters race that basically took over the whole square. There were other moments when the square was just absolutely filled with dancing people, in complete contrast to the august militarist, in a way, statuary.
And in complete contrast too to your idea that this is like old physical anthropology, where people are frozen in time as physical objects and studied. I mean, this is not frozen in any way. It's alive, it's anarchic, as you said, it's so unpredictable, and it's very often very funny.
Very, very funny.
We're being so serious here talking about this, but yeah. How can I ask, change track a little bit, can I ask a question that Hans Ulbricht asked you as well? How has changed your work? I mean, I've just been inside your head.
Good.
In Bermondsey. You can crawl around inside the new work. How has it?
I think
or
it's
is it
part.
Too early to
it's
tell?
part of a big interrogation that has been going on, or anyway, a continuing interrogation that's been going on in the work, which is can art or sculpture, rather than being an object that in some senses colonizes, occupies and displaces space, become a space through which the viewer becomes the viewed. Not just for themselves, in terms of proprioception, that means direct bodily experience, or auto-observation, in terms of just being aware of the sensorium of their what's happening to them physically, but also observe each other in the context of the given space of the work, and I think the Fourth Plinth and One Another, in some senses, has fed into Model. Which is the first time. The work for the last 25 years has been sort of going down like a parallel tracks. On the one hand, trying to make objective correlatives of what it feels like to inhabit the body always for me as a place rather than a thing. And on the other hand, making architectural installations that activate a space, a room, in such a way that the viewer becomes aware of their own position in time and space. And for the first time with Model, those two things have come together. So here it is a vastly inflated body space that has become architecture, but is in a way referential to a body, but at the same time is a labyrinth, a series of cells, a place in which light and dark, anticipation and memory come together in a personal experience. But I think participation, that idea of making things that constitute a place where experience can somehow be not only had, but also somehow shared, inquired into, transmitted.
Might we say that the focus on the body and the figure was more towards the track of the alienated individual in an environment, and now we move towards something that's more like social alienation. We're still striving for an escape from alienation, but now the better political position, if you like, or the kind of action, direct action, is a way you describe the change in your work, is to make this introspection social, collective.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what was good about the One and Other event, when it became, even if silly, somehow a community event. And some of the other great art interventions in big spaces. You think of Eliasson's Weather Project and what was happening towards the end of that. It was very much a social event. Although when the lights switched off, I don't know if anyone was there, everything just dissolved away. Like we became our alienated selves once again.
But it's really interesting this because I mean to really answer your question, the most obvious transposition of what I learnt through that year of being with One Another and the Plinth came out in a project that just finished three months ago in Hamburg, and it was called Horizon Field Hamburg, where curiously I've allied Horizon Field Vorarlberg, which is 100 body forms like the Watchers of Event Horizon placed to make a false horizon at 2,039 meters above mean sea level over 150 square kilometers of the Austrian Alps. I have now reconsidered that, and it's called Horizon Field Hamburg, and it's a platform, a flat black mirror, 50 meters long by 25 meters wide, that interestingly enough is above the ground at exactly the same height, 7.25 meters from the ground, as the plinth in Trafalgar Square. This wasn't intended, but it just happened because of the way that the Deichtorhallen, this large Zeppelin hall in the middle of Hamburg, was made. And this, in the sense of an instrument through which the viewers become the viewed, and the democratization, in inverted commas, of the space of art, in which the whole relationship between figure and ground, that was in a way conceived in a very traditional way in relation to plinth and occupant in One Another, suddenly here was this platform that could be occupied by 100 people at a time. This platform was suspended by 8 cables. It had an oscillation pattern of about 0.8 hertz. It could swing up to 1.78 meters. Any individual movement was transmitted through this membrane by vibration. It was very thin. There was 5 tons of polyurethane that made this absolutely reflective black surface that was like a lake in the sky. But nevertheless, it transmitted the footfall of anybody on it to everyone else on it. So there was this imperceptible, well, anyway, subliminally perceptible notion of a collection of bodies occupying this common ground, which was highly vulnerable. There was no fence around this thing. You were in the world but not of it. If one person began to walk in a particular way, or communicated to maybe 3 others that they were able to walk in a particular way, which was essentially 3 paces forward, you would pause, and then 3 paces back, that took up that 5.8 seconds necessary to start the whole thing oscillating. The whole thing would go, and it would begin to swing. Anyway, for me, this is a very large space. You have to imagine it in the roof of this huge space that was originally designed as a market or a flower hall. And we removed the windows at eye level. We took out the obscured windows, put in clear glass. So from this vantage point of a space embedded in the centre of the city, they could look out at, as it were, the world they left as an image, as a representation. So this is exactly, actually, in a way, the reverse of the plinth, insofar as it was collective people up there looking out at the city, but from within a cultural context, within a cultural institution. And well, anyway, this is maybe the most obvious, continuation of what I learned from the One Another project.
The One Another project continues in some sense. It's being archived and collected, and people will be poring over it, and I suppose there will be dissertations being written every 10 years, and I've even read some recently. Thank you for that, Catherine. Hugh, is it anthropology?
Well, I was just wondering about I was thinking of how often I've heard Antony say, or read you quoted as saying, that your work is anthropological. And I think it's anthropological in 2 ways. One, of course, it's your intense and brilliant interest in the body, and the inhabiting of the body is a very anthropological idea, I think. It's also anthropological because of your preoccupation with and response to community. And I think there's been community in your work for a long time, and from whether it's a community of a huge number of small figures all looking at us, or a community of people on a salt lake in Australia, or all your insider work is about community. So in that sense, I think anthropology, community, preoccupation with anthropological type questions is there. But do you think of it as anthropological, or can you say a bit more about why you think of it as anthropological?
No, I think I'm following really the call of Joseph Beuys, which is that the art world as a tribe has become a very highly specialised and introverted world, and I think that I feel that the very fact that I can make things is a gift. I want it to be shared. I don't think that as it were, the tribe of the institutionalization and the specialization of art in our time has served art's ability to be a gift to, I suppose, a wider world and a wider community. And I've tried to find ways of not only offering the work, as it were, in collective space. So another place ends up on a beach that is about as far as the inscripted spaces of an institution as you can get. But I've also tried to make art collectively, and you could say that One Another is an example of that. But Hugh's quite right that Field, I think that was my first. I mean, that was a very, very important moment for me. It was literally a moment of crisis. At the end of the 80s, I've been working on my own, in a way, living that life of the modernist artist as the unique individual that is able to give his or her work value within a studio in which the world was, in a way, kept out and remade on the individual's terms within it. And I felt incredibly, yes, privileged, but also unbelievably isolated in that position. And the result was Field. I took all the money that we had and flew to Mexico and made this work that was I felt was the complete opposite of everything. I had been making these lead body cases that were, I think, very, very much to do with my own alienation as much as kind of an attempt to make hermetic statements about human space and space at large. And I think from that moment onwards, I've tried to find ways of escaping from, yes, I suppose the modes of presentation of contemporary art that are, I think, well, on the one hand, late capitalism has made the commodification of the art object as a primary vehicle of capital exchange, where exchange value is far more important than use value. You know, that's one side, and then we have, as it were, the intellectual specialization of art that has meant that people feel that it's a bit like science, something that they maybe don't understand. I put all of this actually in a degree in the past, because I think that one of the exciting things is that in the last 10 to 15 years there has been, and I would say that the Licensed Weather Project is a very good example of this, an explosion in the degree to which people wish to participate in and experience the space of art as an open space of possibility. But I've gone rather a long way out of that. I mean, I think for me the call of Joseph Beuys' question, what is art? We don't know. We have to make it. What is a man? We don't know. We have to make him. And the idea that those two things can come together in a collective idea of the interrogation of who we are.
Let's take exactly that moment to break with the modernist thing of a couple of three old men sitting on a plinth talking and get everyone to move their necks in a different way by having a discussion with the other, a collective thing, and see if there are any questions for. And I see if you're ready, and you're first up there. Please speak into the mic, yeah. And so everyone can twist their neck a bit. And
thank you. Antony, you spoke of the geography of Trafalgar Square between the political in the National Parliament and cultural in the National Gallery. But obviously participants were drawn from regions across the UK. Do you think that translated into a strong sense of regional cultural and political identity in the work? Or do you think by proximity of the geography it was often far more skewed towards a national identity?
It's intriguing, that, isn't there? We could have had more bagpipes, for instance. There could have been, I suppose more sort of Celtic singing. But what I was struck by was, in spite of, as it were, our insistence on distributing the hours demographically, it was much more about individuals than it was about where they came from.
But the map on the back of the book.
Sorry, what about the map? You mean the world map on the back of the book?
Where people came from.
Yeah, the map. We keep referring to this book. I'm very, very proud of the fact that Jonathan Cape, agreed to publish a book in which Hugh's essay, amongst others, is I think extremely enlightening. An extremely enlightening, meditation on what this thing might be. At the back of the book there's a map that shows you where the 8 million hits on the website came from. And it is an extraordinary thing how distributed, when you ask about kind of, how much it became about regional identity within the British Isles, I think in my view it didn't. But it did become a global phenomenon, and it was a very, very extraordinary thing at the launch of the book. yeah, 4 people came from Los Angeles who said that their entire lives had been focused on this thing that was happening, the other side of the world, and the distribution across certainly the English-speaking world, including Japan, Korea, and South Africa, for example, in terms of the take-up of the plinth. I think that was an extraordinary inversion of what you might be suggesting, that in fact, in this moment of the exposure of individual lives to, as it were, not just the public gaze in Trafalgar Square, but to, as it were, the gaze of the world through the internet, there was enormous interest, irrespective of nationhood.
In the front here. Indication of anyone else who's coming up.
Thank you so much for the plinth and for so much of your work. I think it was the 1960s, Piero Manzoni put a plinth in a museum. And the only time I ever saw it was in the Serpentine, and there was a rope around it saying you weren't allowed to stand on it anymore. But I wonder whether, if you compare that piece with your piece, what that comparison might tell us. One, about the context, which is extremely different. Two, about the question of spontaneity, because, I mean, I'm presuming, maybe I'm wrong about this, that Manzoni's original piece, museum goers would just step up there. Maybe that's wrong, but if that was the intent, then there's an element of spontaneity in his piece, that whereas in your piece there was a lot of planning and thinking ahead of time. And the third one is the relationship of the participants and the viewers, which is extremely different. Because in Trafalgar Square, it was mainly about people watching, right? So I just wonder if that, I'm not asking which of these is better or worse or anything like that, obviously, but what this comparison might tell us, if anything.
I think you're talking about the Socle du Monde, aren't you? And if you are, that was a absolutely brilliant kind of conceit, where you think of the planet as the sculpture, and he simply made it's a iron box with Socle du Monde written on it upside down, and you're supposed to put yourself into the mental picture where you're thinking about the world as the art object, and this is simply the plinth for that world. It wasn't an invitation for the members of the public to jump on it. In terms of spontaneity, I think that it's. I mean, you just remind me of my original concept, which was, oh, well, what we'll do, my piece would just be a ladder. And it's incredible what happens to a simple, naive concept like that when you try and make it real in the present world. Health and safety, emergency service, I mean,
collective work, right? Health and safety.
No, but I mean, when he asked to what extent did it get out of your hands, well, right from the bloody get-go, it was. I mean, we had scenario training. There were 100 people in a room, 10 to a table. They had to elect a chairman. We then had to imagine, what happens when somebody shoots when they shoot themselves up there. I was saying, well, they've got to shoot. If they shoot themselves at the end of their hour, that's fine. If they shoot themselves at the beginning of the hour, they've got to stay up there. The body's got to stay. Oh no, that's quite impossible. Anyway, all of that.
Getting this on tape, right? No. Down here.
This is more of a comment as a postgraduate anthropology student. Not so much a question, but I found it interesting how most of the talk seems to fall in a binary discussion of alienation or socialization, how we kind of we tend to talk about separating the two. And what I find most interesting about the work studying anthropology is how these collective spaces of art we actually is a platform to ask questions as to where these feelings of alienation are coming from, and actually why people are possessed to participate or not to participate. And actually, how is this collective art a collective experience, or is it actually just sort of self-fulfilling, some kind of self-interest? And perhaps this can lead us to ideas of cosmology and sort of where we are today. So I just thought, I'm not sure if you need to break down the opposition between alienation, socialization, maybe actually see how they're actually much more intertwined than maybe is apparent on the surface. So anyway, but thank you.
No, really brilliant observation. And it is, I mean, there is no, in my, in a way, meditation on what happened, I think there's no question. There's a very, very strong desire of people to be part of something if they are offered the opportunity. And you could say that is an expression of the fact that they feel that they're not, or that somehow their lives don't count, that they don't have enough, as it were, value in terms of life as lived. I mean, that I'm not saying that's true, but I think that is a very, very profound feeling. And this is one of the touching things, and it connects absolutely with what John was saying about nostalgia. There is a touching but also tragic thing that somehow art is somehow to do with the eternal, or somehow to do with something that transcends the fugitive, provisional and out of controlness of our lives, and that somehow by being part of something like this, some meaning that would otherwise be missing is somehow attained.
We're going to add just one rider. That very important, so almost parenthesis in your question is, what about those people who are impelled not to be part of this project? I mean, if this is mass observation, then we need to know about them too, don't we?
It's true.
Yeah. The anthropologist wants to have everyone under them. It's an hour session, and we're really coming to the end. I'll squeeze in one more, and it's you. Sorry to everybody else, but it's an hour session.
Your artworks often you spoke about how you thought the art world has become like introverted and sort of like so sort of deep in their ideas that it doesn't sort of serve its purpose that you mentioned, and like your installation at Bermondsey and like sort of your male sculptures as well, they're all very it's the way that they take up space and the way that that we are meant to interact with them. It seems sort of very it seems sort of bang on in that that if you compare like medieval manuscripts and how people were so attuned to reading images, that do you think people today are still able to read images in the same way, or do you think your sort of style of including viewers is sort of is the best way now? Like, are we still able to read images in the same way that like medieval people could, do you think?
Well, I think it's a lovely idea that everybody in medieval times was able to have access to and could, as it were, interpret manuscripts, because I don't think they could, but I imagine they would have that access. But I imagine that if we think about medieval cathedrals and what they represented, they were the place of collective reading, of collective myths that made sense of the community. I think that our relationship with art has profoundly and fundamentally and in a revolutionary way changed from that use of, in a way, the reinforcement of identity and collective identity through, as it were, the illustration of collective myths. I think now, for me, art is about encountering the unknown, the uncertain, the in a way unutterable, the thing that resists symbolization, and to that degree is about a completely open response to the work, the time that the work takes, the occasion of the arising of the work, which is, I think, a shared job. And in that respect, I think whatever that time, it's a combination, I think, of Cubism, you could say late Cubism and 1915, the general theory of relativity. I think the world is not one that can be illustrated anymore. And it's the shift from, in a way, representational object to reflexive object, or representational object to reflexive place, that I think characterizes the really exciting invitation of what art is today.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. We this discussion can go on. Right? I'm sure can we have another hour? I reckon we should thank Hugh Brody for coming as well. At fairly short notice, thank you, Hugh, and Antony. Thank you very much. And don't forget to go and see the other maquettes of the contest for the Fourth Plinth and the rest of the exhibition. There's some great things in there, including the protest ones, Sakari Camp's excellent little piece that won the popular vote but didn't get the vote of the commissioners, and various other bits. And look at the archive. I think there's some great stuff there.
Yeah, all 2,400 hours are now part of the British Library Internet archive. Should you want to relive the experience of 2009.
If you want to see some flinters, there they are. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, John.